I don't know about you, but my knee-jerk reaction to Jesus' words to Thomas is not very reassuring. He says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." Okay, but the apostles saw before they believed, and Thomas not accepting, being the last to see and believe. They're the example that we have to follow, and we're supposed to make do, it seems, with less than them. So to say, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe, seems to be like saying, blessed are those who have half a deck of cards, but yet still manage to win sometimes. Or blessed are the one-armed baseball players and yet still manage to find a way to play. We love to hear a story about how somebody makes the most of odds that are against them and succeeds anyway. But it's not so encouraging to know you have no choice but to proceed like that. So let's look a little bit closer at Jesus' words to see if we can find more encouragement in them. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." He doesn't say they're to be congratulated, those who believe, because they are spiritual giants or have attained some great feat. He just simply says that they are blessed. And to be blessed means that someone who's blessed, it doesn't say they've done extraordinary works or that they're heroic. It simply means that they've received blessing from God. So looking at it in this way reframes the way Jesus speaks to Thomas and reframes the way we can receive his words as well. So Jesus' words aren't so much a challenge to the reader to say, get yourself blessed by believing, but rather it's a promise to the hearer. It's a promise that his people will be blessed as they believe. And so, sure, Thomas was blessed because he was able to see, and he was blessed to be able to touch Jesus and behold the wounds in his side. But those who have not seen and yet believe are also blessed. In fact, the exchange suggests that those who have not seen and yet believe are more blessed. So let's look closer at how we can embrace this blessing promise to believers. But first, let's look closer at the apostles, because they still are models for us to follow. So those blessed apostles. So what about those poor apostles who lacked the blessings of those who were privileged to not see and yet believe? So maybe they're the ones who are operating with a half a deck of cards. Well, that doesn't ring true. And why? Because, of course, we need firsthand accounts, and they had a role to play, and God blessed them in that role. And rest assured, though, that this was only the beginning for them. They would also be called to believe without seeing. And so, how did this look? The apostles couldn't carry forward the message of the gospel unless they had this resurrection principle operating in their lives. And they had not yet seen this. They needed to believe that God would work the resurrection within them by giving them the words they need to bring forward the gospel, and by working in them the love of Jesus so that they can be examples to others. And they had to believe that the resurrection would be at work around them by opening up opportunities for them to share the gospel. They had not yet seen this, but they were called to believe it. And so this was true certainly for Thomas as well. So let's consider simply 3 ways in which Thomas was called to continue in this belief. But note that Jesus' words for him carry a light rebuke because, yes, he will have to learn to believe without seeing, but he could have done it now. He's just simply delayed the inevitable by insisting on being able to see Jesus. But he would have many opportunities to yet not see and still believe. These three examples I think we can relate to, and they will help us to relate more to Thomas. Now, Thomas was called to be a missionary, but he wasn't a religious leader. And so public speaking would not have come naturally to Thomas, just like it doesn't to most people. And surveys show that people tend to fear public speaking more than they fear death itself. So for Thomas to go out there and to begin his ministry as a religious leader would have felt like a death to him. Imagine the criticism, imagine the ridicule, imagine the persecution. But he went out having not yet seen, but believing, as he trusted that somehow that resurrection principle would be at work and God would raise him up as a religious leader. So that's one example. The second example is simply that, as we know historically, that as tradition tells us, that Thomas was the one who went to bring the gospel to India. Now, in those days, to travel such a long distance was very dangerous. In fact, many people didn't survive. So to travel all the way to India, he would have had to be willing to die. But he had to trust that the resurrection principle was at work around him and that God would enable him to go forward, and that having not seen, he would yet believe that God would see him through, carry him to the end of his journey. And thirdly, once he got there, he would be sharing the gospel to people who didn't even know about the faith of Israel, let alone the faith of Jesus that came out of that. Thomas would have not seen faith in this kind of context yet. Furthermore, he didn't know what kind of a hostile reception he might encounter. He had not yet seen whether or not he would be permitted to live long enough to share the gospel and have it bear fruit. But he trusted in that resurrection principle, that somehow God would enable him to go forward and would raise up new believers from his efforts. So that's how this resurrection principle worked in the life of Thomas, and this is the principle that is at work in your life and mine as well. So we've looked at how God blessed the apostles as having not seen, they believed. How can this be true for you and me as well? So let's consider for a moment how you are called to receive this resurrection principle in your life right now. If you hesitate in some area of your life, this is probably not because you're lazy, but because you fear the unknown. It's because you fear what you haven't seen. But if you give your life to Christ, and if you put him first, then that resurrection principle and Jesus' promise that goes along with it is at work in your life as well. Jesus says that just as for Thomas, you are blessed when you have not seen and yet believe. So let's ask, what kind of duty are you procrastinating right now because you don't know how it will turn out? You are blessed when you have not seen and yet believe to move forward in it anyway. Or what dream have you not pursued because you don't yet know how you're going to reach your goal? Blessed are you who have not seen, but yet believe that if you just write down the first step and pursue it, that God will carry you through. So if you have not seen and choose not to believe, then you're simply forsaking the blessings that go along with this promise. But Jesus offers the blessing of the resurrection principle to you now. So let's let that sink in for a moment. Jesus offers the blessing of this resurrection principle to you now, having not seen, yet believing. Now, I could just stop right here. We've looked at the passage and taken something from it and thought about how we can apply this to our lives. But I'm asking you to bear with me just for 2 or 3 more moments as we look at our epistle reading from St. Peter, because it directly applies to this gospel and will help us to go a little bit more deeper so that we can apply it more thoroughly to our lives. So let's consider Peter's belief. In our epistle reading, Peter describes the resurrection principle applying to the believers of his day, which applies in every day, in our day as well. He says, by his great mercy, we have been born anew to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So not only was Jesus raised, but you have been born anew. And to what kind of a hope? To a living hope. This is not an inanimate hope. This is the hope of our living and active God, of our living and active Lord Jesus Christ, who is raised and is active in your life now. He is ready to respond to your prayers and to bless you as you move forward, having not seen and yet believing. And so Peter continues, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, which though perishable is tested by fire, may bear fruit. Now this is the not having seen part. We're still in a fallen world where trials come, and these trials will test your faith. But don't forget the ironclad promise of our Lord. Blessed are you when you believe enough to persevere. That's why Peter says that you rejoice, even though these tests of faith come. Then Peter concludes his passage, and this is so helpful because these words are almost as if he just heard this gospel that was chanted, and he wants to finish this message for us. He says this, without having seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with unutterable and exalted joy. And then he takes this to another level. He says, as the outcome of your faith, you obtain the salvation of your souls. So by way of conclusion, let's return to Thomas with this last emphasis of Peter. As the outcome of your faith, you obtain the salvation of your souls. The blessing of faith isn't just temporal, but eternal. And this gives you perspective on the souls of other people as well as your own. Thomas didn't see how God would bless his efforts in India before he moved forward. He believed in every step of the way, but he would never see the full fruition of his efforts in his lifetime. In fact, we know that whole Christian communities grew up long after he was gone in India. And this confirms Jesus' promise to those who have not seen. Likewise, for you and me, we're called to plant seeds. And often the seeds we sow are watered by those who come long after us. And so part of Jesus' blessings to you and to all believers is the assurance that God will carry forward your work even beyond what you can see. Now, you may not be called to be a missionary like St. Thomas, but you are called to save souls. And how is this? By the excellence of your work, by your creativity, by the witness of your life to those around you. And there's no way for you to see the full effect of this in the souls of others. But by believing in God's work through you, you have the blessed assurance that your life matters. Now, finally, Thomas could not see his eternal reward. But when it came time for him to die, he could hold on to that resurrection principle. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And so, with this assurance, he could be courageous in front of his persecutors and receive martyrdom as a bold witness of one who believes that God will bless his efforts. And so, what will you face tomorrow? How will you hold on to this promise that those who have not seen yet believe will be blessed? We'll know that this promise applies to you. And let us go forward with the assurance, blessed are those who have not seen and yet